So yeah, systems of production. So remember this term, this phrase, systems of production, because it's going to come back. This is the way in which an economy is organized to produce commodities to sustain a society. Basically money. However, they are going to get money, whether it's by hunting and gathering or trading, or well, being mainly back there it was hunting, gathering, and agriculture. Right, that's the one I forgot. So what I want to make note of, is that there were two indigenous people at the time, the Tanos and the Caribs, and the agricultural surplus was by the Tanos because they were a more peaceful and actually advanced society, and they wouldn't just hunt and gather to be subservient. They would actually have a surplus, and they would trade with the inland society, so basically the Americas and stuff like that. They were actually actually a lot more advanced than the Caribs, and it was only later that the Spanish brought in the idea of gold and silver. Excuse me. Next thing that they would do, again, this is pre-slave trade, so it would be slash and burn, and I think this was performed mostly by the Tanos as well, possibly by the Caribs as well, but maybe a little later after. So you should know the process of this slash and burn cultivation, basically, and it was a process where just before the rains come, they would set fire to the dry crops, reduce them to ashes, and then remove, because what this would do would remove any pests and release nutrients for the new plants. Because usually what they would do was like crop rotation, where you would plant in a certain area, and when you reap from that area, move to another area and kind of circle and come back around, right? But this slash and burn tactic was better because they could plant more space at once, right? They would just have to wait for the time for it to dry and stuff like that, because as you can see, the last step before burning them was that you have to cut down the crops that you just planted, or sorry, that you just harvest, and leave them to dry. So it would only be the drying process rather than the rotation. The second part would actually be spreading the ashes after you burn them, and obviously you plant back the new seeds. So I don't know why, but there's a question that comes on this sometimes, so that's why they said I can go through it. Can't remember what it was though, but yeah. Next I want to talk about the plantation system. So this is, that was a little bit from last week that I didn't cover before the slave trade, but I did cover everything on the slave trade and stuff, and that video was pretty comprehensive, and I covered the other points I left out. So now this is after, or kind of during, the slave trade. So the plantation system, the Caribbean was mainly used for sugar, yes, and the mainlands and Americans produced cotton. Africa and the Far East produced tea and coffee. All had their own plantation system. It was just for different goods. For this same plantation system and for the labor to harvest the sugar and all that, it relied on the Atlantic slave trade to supply the raw materials, and this was, I will say, about the third leg of the triangular trade, Atlantic trade, as you want to call it, which was basically surrounded around sugar, rum, molasses, and it would usually be going to places like France and Holland and England as well. It also, the money that came from this provided funding for Europe to manufacture industrial things for war and whatever have you, and the plantations were basically a form of investment to finance buildings in Europe. So that's what they were using this for, and that is going to come back in to be important for why the plantation system kind of died out. Because remember, they were using it as funding for a lot of their activities back home, right? Next, I move on to, I can barely see my notes. Right, next I move on to indentureship. So this was, there's a very big time gaps in between this. This is why I kind of hate it. But indentureship, also known as another form of slavery, and I explained to you it was another form of slavery, but it came into practice because there started to be a lack or a shortage in slaves to actually produce the labor. So then that's where this term indentureship comes from. Indentureship is basically free people who are not technically not slaves, but they're binded by, let's say, a contract to the person where they have to work for them. So they are given meals and very low wages, which is completely different to slavery, because slavery you may get meals just to survive, but you don't get no wage. But it was very, 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 very low wages, and they were almost treated like slaves in a sense. And I'll tell you what I mean. So Chinese immigrants were, I think those are the ones that came to, I don't want to say Barbados, but our side of the Caribbean that would help with the sugar plantations. And unlike slavery, they were allowed to speak their language and maintain their traditions, well, as best they could in the circumstances. As I say, they were paid extremely low wages. The accommodation and where they would stay and where they would sleep was very, very unsanitary. It caused a lot of diseases and death most of the time. They were always in debt to whoever it was they were working for. Like that's how they were set up. Even when they had to buy and sell like that, they would set it up so it was almost a cycle, so they could not get out of this, say, indentureship. So it was basically slavery, to be honest. They were assigned to a particular plantation, and they were not allowed to move around freely. They could move around in that plantation, even after work and stuff, but they weren't able to leave. If they tried to escape, they were hunted down and jailed for breach of the contract, because as I said, kind of indentureship was kind of like a contract. And then they would be eventually returned to the plantation. Many died from poor nutrition and suffered from malaria and a bunch of other diseases that I will not try to call. So basically they was in a continuous state of poor health and basically poor. So suicide rates were really high. As I said, it was almost another form of slavery, but it was the way that the plantation society actually survived, because it was a saving grace basically to plantation society. But as I said, remember I said I alluded to it earlier, that the Europeans eventually gave up on the plantation society, and the reason that they did was because it was no longer bringing in like enough money to fund their activities. And I think at that time something else that came up where they were making more money from that, and it just didn't make necessarily as much sense to continue with this plantation system. Also, when I deal with the next section, which is resistance, when you see the resistance that they face in terms of getting labor to continue doing this, it wasn't worth it. I think that was the main reason. Also, a side note too is that there was not only Chinese indentureship, there was Indian indentureship, and that saved the sugar plantations for the British, the French, and the Dutch Caribbean. But Chinese was, as I say, I want to say our Caribbean, but I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. But the same thing, very low wages for them as well, the Indian indentureship, and pretty much the same conditions. So it was almost, again, like a form of slavery. See how much time I have? I don't have much. I'll go over though. So resistance, I will try to say a little less and keep to the slides. So a deal with resistance now that they would have faced, and this is pre and during the Atlantic slave trade. So the native people, the Tanos, although they were known to be a peaceful people, when forced or when their hands were tied and basically pushed towards violence, they were violent people, and they basically, it took the Spanish a very long time to finally conquer them. I think the Spanish eventually did, however, but given how advanced their technology was, it took them quite some time. When they realized that they were facing genocide, and by them I mean the Tano people, many conflicts broke out, and there were always the fights for superiority. And it was not until I think the years were 1513 when they finally won the war for Puerto Rico, and then it was like 1520. They were still fighting like guerrilla warfare for Cuba, and they would also resist by like running away and withdrawing from certain areas and just settling in another area. So kind of like backtracking all the time and kind of just dodging the Europeans in a sense, which made it very hard because remember the Europeans were just trying to get them for labor. So you're spending all this money on the ships and the weapons and what have you to chase these people or to get these people into captivity, and they're basically playing with you in a sense, but it's for them life, so I can't call it playing with them. The Caribs on the other hand, though, these were a more warrior-like, as we know, group, and they fought hard. And even though they came close to extermination, unlike the Tanos, they could not be fully subdued, and eventually there were treaties formed to protect them. Throughout this time, they where is it? Right, even when the Spanish would capture like certain territories that they owned, they would loop around and come back and attack them again. So they lost a lot of manpower. It was just too much for the Europeans to continue doing as to get a form of labor. And this is another reason why they turned to the Africans, and that's why another reason why the Atlantic slave trade was brought up, because they needed that extra labor, and you can see what they were going through to get the labor from the indigenous people that they came and found there. So that's when now I will talk about the resistance of the Africans. So even though yes, the Africans were, you know, like basically free slaves, they didn't have to work and fight against them to get them, they were passive forms of resistance. So it included sabotage and damaging the tools that they would work with and equipment and other properties belonging to the planter. They would also, you know, like illnesses that they would get or purposely make themselves sick in a sense to avoid working. Also feigning ignorance, acting that I don't understand the instructions, too dumb, I don't get what you're saying, I don't get what you want me to do, and doing the wrong things, and you know, stuff like that. Because these would obviously, if you have know anything about business, you can't run if you have people doing these things all the time, so it would make it hard for the planters, for the plantation owners, sorry, to get, you know, like good harvests from the crops and stuff like that. They would also go as far as suicide, killing themselves. Some people did that, and abortions as well, because what this would do would, instead of them being able to, but in my opinion, this was a kind of cutthroat activity, abortion, because what you would do is stop, you know, future children to grow up in the same slavery, which is fair, but then it will also cause more or a higher demand for more slaves from Africa to be brought in, since they can't basically breed them, right? But these were only a few ways that of the passive resistance. There was much other things that they would do, and I want to mention some of those. There's one that's pretty important because it leads into a rebellion that happened that I have to talk about. So they would also, one of the other, no, this was in cultural resistances, yeah, this one. So the Europeans tried to brainwash and take away the culture to make them more subservient and controllable, but they were met by smart tactics with the Africans to keep culture, or to keep their culture and as a means of resistance. And how they did this was that, because the Europeans were trying to wipe out the aspect of the African culture, right? But what they would do, they kind of hybrid their culture into Christianity in a sense, so they could still continue to practice it, and they would tell the enhanced stories that we know, well, we should know. And if you really think about the enhanced stories, they were rooted, and the songs and performance were actually to ridicule the white men, but secretly so. And that was with another kind of passive resistance, but it was more culture resistance. And their drums as well. I think they used to play drums to actually communicate, but this was quickly snuffed out, especially after the Haitian Revolution of 1791. Now this is a revolution that you should read up on to get some more information, because I won't be able to give you much of it. But this is related now, instead of culture resistance, to armed resistance. But because they didn't have much weapons, they weren't able to communicate after the drums were banned, because that was another part of their culture that the Africans tried to, that the Europeans tried to take away. But I think it was Frenchmen, children of the Frenchmen, who were actually free people, and this is in Haiti. They were educated and had other careers and stuff like that, but because it was a very kind of segmented society, they suffered discrimination because they weren't totally white, and because of the privilege that they lack and stuff like that, they actually revolted against the whites, and this provided an opportunity for the African slaves, because there was a, imagine if you were in slavery and the person who's your slave owner or whatever gets in a fight with some other random body that has nothing to do with you. Are you just going to sit there and do nothing, or are you going to help your slave owner? No. I mean, the sensible thing there to do is gang up with those people and, you know, get yourself out of slavery. So that's what the Haitian Haitian Revolution was in 1791. It was big, really big, and it wiped out, I think, an entire town. If I got the numbers correct, it was 350,000 people that died in that revolution, and a lot of Africans did manage to escape, but lots of people died as a result. That was one of the biggest armed resistances by the Africans to date. So we now get to the abolition of slavery. This is kind of the ending. So I think one of the things that sparked it was that ex-slaves, maybe some that got away in the Haitian Revolution, who knows. Point is that they wrote about their experiences, and they actually toured the Caribbean campaigning for the ending of slavery, and this was in around 1770. And I think I was supposed to have the reparations movement. Do I have it here? Oh, I have it here. So this was after emancipation, though. It still did not mean that it was the complete end of slavery. They still had to fight for systems of production. Remember I said, I alluded again to this. System of productions again is a way for them to make money, because they still wouldn't be employed or wouldn't have a way of for livelihood to make money and, you know, provide for their society or community or themselves, basically. So this is what the reparations movement was, and what that was that African groups and organizations set up like committees and in different countries, and basically publicize them intention for seeking compensation. That's what reparations really is compensation. I think you hear reparations in America recently. The reparations or the compensation was basically for the deaths of millions of the Africans in the slave trade, which made sense. It was also for the forced labor, for the years, hundreds of years that they were enslaved, and also for the resources that was taken out of Africa, because it was not only slaves. It was like copper, I think, was one of the examples used. They took a lot of the resources from Africa and hoarded it for themselves. And last but not least, we have indentured immigrants. I can't really wrap this up so fast. The indentured immigrants also followed suit. So remember I told you about the Chinese and the Indian indentured? They also followed suit, and they had the same struggle for improved life. And they did very much the same thing that the Africans did in terms of trying to get reparations. And I think I could end here. Yeah, I can end here. So I hope that you understand everything it covered. It was a little bit of the historical, still a bit of the historical process and migration and stuff like that, a bit of the slave trade, and also the resistance that not only the indigenous people would have presented to the Europeans or the Spaniards or Spanish, whatever you want to call it, people from Spain, and also the Africans, what role they played in it, and all of this again is shaping the Caribbean as we know it. But that is it for today.